Hello, this is Ron Kohler showing you the slides from the presentation that I gave at the Midwest Academy of Management Conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in October of 2013. It is entitled Revisiting the Resistance Commitment Paradigm. It describes the doctoral research and the theoretical underpinnings of a model that I've created. And it also begins to show how I'm using that model, using a tool, a short survey, to provide organizational change leaders with a snapshot tool to really better examine what are the types of behaviors that people are exhibiting while we're implementing a change, so we can make better decisions about how can we respond and help our folks shift course when needed. As I look out into industry, being a change practitioner myself, current change evaluation tools are primarily centered around either what happens before a change or after a change. Before the change, a lot of good work's been done on readiness assessments, and I definitely think they have their place. However, like a marriage, a change readiness assessment can be helpful before you get married. I remember when I got married, and we had a pastor that had us go through some tests, and we talked it over to see if we were ready to be married or not. And that was fine, but 12 months later, when one of us has clothes on the floor and the other one's unhappy about it, it wasn't like we were pulling out the marriage readiness assessment saying, boy, this is going to be really helpful to us right now. We needed something to help us right there in that moment during the change, because it was a big life change for both of us. In organizations now, more frequently we're seeing compliance audits after the change. I don't need to mention anything more than hospitals, because they probably have the most experience with this, or ISO 9 audits in manufacturing, where everybody scrambles to get ready for the audit because they know when it's going to come, make sure we get the check in the box, and then we can go back to doing what we're doing before. Starting to see this with change management, and it's not what we're going. If I look at things from a manager's perspective, managers like simplicity. If I'm a manager, change management while I'm a consultant is my entire life, and that's how I look at everything. But if I'm a manager, it's just part of my job. It's not a big part of my job either. There's a strategic change going on, and people are either going to resist it or they're going to commit to it. And as a manager, I don't want people to resist it, and so I'm trying to herd them into this commitment box. It's one or the other. It's a dichotomy. It's that simple. In research, surprisingly, going through all the academic databases as I have in the last 5 years, they keep resistance and commitment very separated. In industry, I find that we look at it as two sides of the same coin, very related, but in research, they keep them very separate, and that was something bothersome to me. I said to myself, there has to be an integrated concept of resistance and commitment to match up with the experiences I had as a practitioner and the experiences that my leadership clients have all the time. Fortunately, for my doctoral research, I had to find something that already existed. And thank God for John Meyer from the University of Western Ontario. He and one of his former students, Lynn Herskovich, created this thing called the Behavioral Support for Change Scale, which you can see right here goes from active resistance to passive resistance to compliance to cooperation to champion. It goes, in my words, resistance to commitment, resistance being not what you want, commitment being something you do want. So I was thinking, great, here's a scale I can use for my dissertation, and this was a breakthrough. This was very incredibly helpful. I'm indebted to Dr. Meyer for doing this. He said originally it was just a thought experiment, and I'm glad that several researchers have used this. So if we take a look at the Herskovich and Meyer scale that they created, they use it in a survey on a 1 to 100 scale, or I'm sorry, 0 0 to 100 scale, it's got a qualitative component to it. 0, the resistance end of it is bad, versus 100, the commitment piece of it is good. My initial reactions were that I'm not so sure all resistance is bad. I did think originally that all commitment was good. But I also have to say I am a consultant, and so I just can't deal with the line. It's got to be some kind of 2x2 model or a way to look at this that's a little bit more complex, because I don't think that individual reactions to change, that this continuum has the complexity to be able to explain dynamics going on. So I immediately thought, well, 2x2. What would be an x-axis and y-axis to try and describe the same phenomenon quantitatively that Herskovich and Meyer set out to and did a great job starting us down the path. From a theoretical standpoint, if Herskovich and Myers helped me with the methods piece, giving me a scale, it was a guy named Leon Coetzee down in South Africa that was one of the theorists to tie together in a non-linear way commitment and resistance to change. You can see his model right here, where he thinks the average individual starts in the lower right and becomes aware, takes note of a change, decides, hey, I'm going to give this a try. They start to get involved. They decide they like it. Hey, I'm committed to this. However, we all know that changes go through many iterations, and what we first set out to do and the original finish line, when it changes, some people who are really committed to that finish line, when it gets moved, they think it's unfair, and they go from being the biggest supporters to the biggest resistance. And Leon calls this overcommitment, where he thinks it's a bridge from being the most committed person to being the most aggressive resistor to this. And you run out of energy. You can't aggressively resist forever, so you go underground. That's the active resistance he's talking about, where you're not as aggressive, and then you finally down into passive resistance, or else I'm going to lose my job. So I can try and find ways to resist this without going noticed, otherwise I'm going to get fired. And sooner or later, whether you're on either side of this curve, his hypothesis is that a lot of people just end up in apathy. I don't really care one way or the other. I just don't have any energy. This was a piece I really liked about this model and really started getting me to think about energy as a construct. So my first question had to do with linearity. Most managers think we need to overcome resistance, we need to stamp out resistance, fight resistance, get rid of resistance. So we need to minimize resistance to change. It sounds good in practice, and in practice, too much resistance to change is a bad thing. Nothing would ever get done. But if we think about that in a linear way, that means that resistance to change, if there's a lot of resistance to change, the performance is low. But the opposite of that would say that low to no resistance to change automatically means higher performance. And we know this isn't true. Instead, the way that we think of resistance as being nonlinear, but haven't really charted out in the way that you see it right here, is that, yes, too much resistance to change, that I've just, for the purposes of this presentation, called gridlock, it's low performance. It's over on the right-hand side. If we have too much resistance, nothing's going to get done. But on the opposite side of it, if we don't have any resistance to change at all, if it's just blind obedience, sooner or later, a leader with some sort of innovative idea could march us off the edge of the cliff, and like James Belasco says in his great book on organizational change called Flight of the Buffalo, if everyone's blindly obedient, they will follow the leader right over the edge of the cliff and we'll all go down. Well, we don't want that. So we don't want blind obedience, or we want people to be able to speak up, but not all the time. Well, that would say And that would imply that there's a full amount of resistance to change. And I don't think this is a normally distributed curve. I don't think it's actually normally distributed. I'm just putting this out here for a theoretical concept and an idea. But definitely one question that I'm asking is, what is the right amount of resistance? And what is the right type of resistance? So as I set out in the research, I figured I would find something like this, but I have to tell you, I struck out. I could not find anything. To my surprise, one of my other questions was, is resistance and commitment an integrated concept? Well, it was actually commitment that I was able to find the curvilinear relationship. As you see right here, effective commitment, which is one of the scales that Dr. Meyer came up with, a team in Australia measured that against something that they called in-role performance, and took a look at, as people become more committed, this is what I want to do. That's what affective commitment is desire. I want this change. There's a ceiling on it. It comes to a point where they can get overcommitted, which, if you think about exercise, that's like saying, hey, if I'm not doing any exercise at all, it's not good. If I go out running, that's great, but if I'm not in good shape and I go run a mile as fast as I can, I'm going to get anaerobic. I'm going to get sick. I'm going to get burned out too much. And that's the implication, I believe, of this wonderful research team, Warren and the other folks, that published down in Australia earlier this year. So I'm looking at, is resistance and commitment, is it linear or nonlinear? So far, the only evidence I could find is that commitment is definitely a nonlinear phenomenon. So as I'm looking at an integrated concept, looking for linear or nonlinear, the other part that really bothers me about resistance and commitment is the stereotype that all resistance to change is bad and all commitment to change is good. Another couple of guys down in Australia about 12 years ago tried to create a model where they took a look at active versus passive resistance and commitment, and overt versus covert. And I give them a lot of credit. I think this was really smart. And if you can read these, you'll see from a support standpoint, if you look in the upper left, it says things like initiate, embrace, support, cooperate. Those sounds like great things. Lower left for support, it says agree, accept. Those sound pretty good. But if you look at the lower right, the support, it says to give in or to comply. I don't think compliance, if you think about the Milgram experiments and other compliance situations, compliance have a dark side to it. And this really was one of the first models I saw before this Morin research in 2013, where I started to question, maybe Coetzee's right about this overcommitment. Maybe all commitment isn't necessarily good. And I also give these guys credit because as you look at the resistance in their four quadrants, upper left, oppose, argue, obstruct, stall, dismantle, undermine, ignore, withdraw, avoid, as you work your way around. I don't want these things. If I'm a leader of a group, I don't want to experience that on a daily basis. Too much of that's going to drive me crazy. If any of that, I'm going to say I had a bad day. But if you look at the lower left, the resistance, they said observe, refrain, wait. Think back to that example I gave you. If a manager says, hey, I got this great idea. We're going to do a brand new matrix structure where everyone's going to have 3 bosses. It's the most innovative thing I've ever seen. We're going to start implementing it starting on Monday. If you wanted to do a good service to that boss, the best thing you could possibly do is get that person to wait. Because if they started that Monday, it could have just disastrous consequences. So that gives a little bit of an argument to, well, some resistance isn't necessarily bad. And I mean, this was 12 years ago. I think this thinking was ahead of its time. I think it was very good, very good. So from a research standpoint, the questions I'm asking are, is resistance and commitment separate or integrated concepts? Will a nonlinear model fit this concept? And can we look at it in a lesser value lens? We're not going to get to completely value-free. I think the argument that was started by Max Weber over a century ago about whether or not science needs to be value-free, I think was misunderstood. What he was really trying to say was, it's not that we're going to lose the values. I mean, too much resistance to change is always going to be bad. There's always going to be toxic resistance to change. What we're saying here is, with the values, is, well, let's not let that undermine the couple of stragglers who might be the positive deviants, or the people that say, hey, I got a better idea than that. Some of those folks, that's called innovation. And if we looked at this resistance with a lesser value lens, perhaps we could see the difference between and the value for some resistance as being a good thing in organization. So I turned to the research, because again, I started out with my dissertation and I want the theoretical underpinnings for this to be solid. And I started with what you see as the Herskovich and Meyer, which was also based upon a guy named Judson, who wrote a book in the early 90s. And it was actually Leon Coetzee from South Africa that brought this up as a theoretical construct and published it in an article in about 99. And so between that article and the Herskovich and Meyer work, I started to look at this scale and say, well, how can we look at this a little bit differently? What if we took the values out? What if we didn't look at resist as bad, but looked at it as neutral? What if we look, because some of it's good, some of it's bad. Most of it's probably bad, but some of it's good. And what if we looked at commitment as most of it's good, but perhaps some of it might be bad? So if we looked at it in a more neutral way. Because I'm not going to deny reality. I'm a consultant. I know way too much aggressive resistance. I've worked in unionized environments. That could be a real toxic, real bad thing. The passive resistance can be just as ugly toxic in union or non-unions. Obedience, when people know that the bosses are making the wrong decision, but I'm just going to salute and do it anyways just to spite them, that can be a bad thing. But I recognize when you have employees taking ownership of change and ownership of their jobs, and they feel like we got to make this place run, they're the people that are holding this organization together. And I still want to honor it. I'm not saying let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. But what I am saying is, while most aggressive resistance is probably bad, there are a few people in there that are saying, no, I don't think we should do this. We need to change course, and I've got a better idea. While passive resistance is definitely bad, sometimes restraint can be a good thing. If somebody knows we're about to do the wrong thing, wouldn't some kind of restraint or whistleblowing apply? This one really surprised me as I looked at the flip side of obedience, because I was so indoctrinated into thinking that Milgram's experiments on obedience meant that all obedience to authority is evil. But the flip side of this is, well, if everybody's not obedient, that's diversity. There's diverging opinions, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, that's a great thing in a lot of cases, but not in every case. I mean, there's deadlines, and there's times when we need to converge, and there's times where we need to diverge. And those are things that, as change leaders, we need to think about. But theoretically, it gives a component that matches up with the obedience piece as we think about a joint resistance and commitment construct. And finally, I mentioned it, while ownership can be positive, high ownership, high commitment, over-commitment in a few cases can be. So just to recap the theory, a little bit like Goldilocks and the three bears here, like too not hot enough, too cold, too hot, just right. Well, too little resistance. In theory, we know it's a bad thing. But in practice, how many of us get to the end of the day and say, geez, I didn't have anybody resisting my change ideas. It was a terrible day. Not so much. How many times do we get to the end of the day and say, oh my God, everybody was second-guessing me. There was so much conflict. It was a terrible day. When in fact, we know that some of that resistance is good. I think because each of us personally, it takes a lot of energy out of us. If we get to the end of the day, experience no resistance, we say, oh, that was pretty good. In practice, even though we know in theory, too little resistance is a bad thing. Commitment, too little commitment, in theory and in practice, is bad. So does that mean there's a just right? Is there a just right for commitment? I know people are thinking, some of this positive deviance might be a good thing, but I'm not quite sure. In theory and in practice, the just amount of commitment is a good thing. Too much resistance in theory and practice, definitely a bad thing. But what about this overcommitment? I mean, here's another one. Coates had a theory. The Australian research team says, hey, we started to find some evidence, but I think the two boxes you see here with the question marks, these are the things that if change leaders knew these things, maybe organizational changes would go better. There was Megan Gerhardt from a Journal for Leadership and Organizational Studies had a good message that she gave in a breakout session where she said, if I can't test the theory I'm describing, then all I've really done is a nice literature review. And I'd say to this point, that's what I've done for you. It's just a nice literature review. What I want to do is quantify this. I want less of a value lens, quantitative research. I want to look at amounts, quantities. I want to be able to count. I want to be able to count this. Instead of saying resistance is good or bad, you can't count that. And a Likert scale from 1 to 5, that's not the kind of counting we're talking about. So things you can count, those are objective measures. You can use a stopwatch, you can use a scale, you can use a tape measure. That's the type of objective measures that would be good to use for those of us involved in change, not these subjective good, bad things. I think we can do better than this. So just a real quick recap, looking for an integrated concept of resistance and commitment, looking to see if we can see that in a nonlinear way and in a more value-free way. So for me it was, what's the x-axis, what's the y-axis? Based, again, on extensive literature review and some experience with this, because I worked with one of the researchers involved in this and did a lot of survey work on one of these metrics. Energy is the first, this would be the y-axis, which is how much energy do you have for this change? We can measure that as an intensity. It's a magnitude. You have high energy or you have low energy. That's one thing that's easier, just like there's a high temperature or low temperature. It's not, well, is this good or bad? That's subjective. The objective part is, well, it's 86 degrees. Some people like it, some people don't. At the end of the day, that means that it's something we want to optimize, because too much energy is a bad thing, not enough energy thing. Lately, some researchers in Europe, Bruck and some of her folks out there, they've developed a model which is half value-free, half value-laden. But I like the work she's done, so I'm using some of her work because she's definitely used the scales for it. And there's a woman named Teresa Wellborn from Cornell originally that did a lot of work on energy scales as well that I've had good luck with. On the other side axis, then, the x-axis would be compliance. To what degree are you complying to the standard? Compliance has been measured by Cialdini and other folks. They've looked at it as more short-term, but it's nonetheless either a yes/no, high compliance, low compliance. You can measure it. I'm looking to develop something that's longer term. And there's other folks right now. There's a great researcher in Australia named Jetton, and he's done some wonderful work around rebels and groups, the values the value of dissent, deviance, difference, divergence, defiance. I mean, it's just a sprinkle, but a little bit can be good. And then there's a guy from Boston University named Pratt who's also done some great work in this area, just looking around. So we can look at energy as a high-low construct. We can look at compliance as a low construct. And if we a change assessment model that I'm hypothesizing is if you look in the upper left-hand corner, and I've purposely drawn this in the way that we stereotype it. I drew it as red because we typically think that is bad. So active non-compliance, high energy non-compliance, that's the people saying, hell no, I'm not going to do this. We consider them the high resistors, they're obstructing, they're being disobedient, opposition. Conflict, though, is conflict always a bad thing? Not necessarily. Again, I think most of that's not good for a change effort, but a sprinkle of it, a little bit of folks in that area would probably be a good thing. If we move to the lower left, as people lose energy, but they still not complying, they're inactive, apathetic, passive, procrastinating. Oh, I'm too busy to do it. I'll get to it. I'll get to it, I promise. Or I didn't know. I wasn't sure how to do it the right way, so I just over it. There's lots of people that show up in this category where they're not doing what we need them to do, but it's not like they're overtly saying, I'm against this change. They're telling us one thing, but they're doing another. I would suspect if you're a manager in an organization going through a lot of changes, you probably recognize that type of behavior. If we look in the lower right quadrant, people who are complying, I'm doing what's expected of me. You told me you wanted me to do this different, I'm doing bare minimum. I'm not real energetic about it, but I need this job. I've got kids and a family and a mortgage, and I can't lose this job. I am going to do at least the bare minimum to make sure I don't lose my job. Is it enough that it's going to make it succeed? No. Is it going in slow motion and going to slow the change down and ensure that it doesn't move at the pace it needs to? Unfortunately, yes. Combine that with the folks from the last quadrant, and most organizational change efforts die. You could really trace it back to the first week when they launched it, and one could make an argument that it failed even before the launch. So the last group, upper right-hand corner, we always think ownership's a great thing. I believe in this commitment, enthusiasm, but as we can see, if you think about the government shutdown, for example, you had a whole group of people that believed one thing, and if you have a different group of people that have mutually exclusive beliefs, then you get into the negative conflict, the negative side of conflict. So sometimes people can be too committed to something at the expense of the whole. My hypothesis is that this is just a snapshot. People move from quadrant to quadrant. Could be day to day, could be week to week, month to month. I'm not sure. That's the nice thing about doing research is this is open inquiry. But if I were to take a snapshot, what would that look like? If I were to give people a 10-question survey that took a look at their energy for a particular strategic change, and then took a look at their level of compliance, how much or how little they're able to do and are doing with respect to that change, what would that look like in terms of a snapshot? Now, this isn't actual data. This is just an illustration of what the data is going to look like when I start the research. I've got a few organizations signed up right now, and this is the results they want. They want to be able to see these slices. I mean, it could be every other month. It depends on the type of implementation. But I really think what people want to know is, are people moving? Are these dots, are they going to be fixed? Are people in these for the long haul, or does it change from month to month, let's just say? And then further, I think down the line, if you look in the upper left quadrant there, the high energy, non-compliance, the opposition, are some of those red dots green? That's where a couple of these positive deviants are. People come up with great ideas. And if you think of the ownership in the upper right-hand corner, are some of those green dots actually red? Are some of those people starting to cross the line from being overcommitted to being opposed to the change? I don't have answers right now. Got a lot of consultants and a lot of researchers excited about this. They think, boy, this is great, a great prism in which to re-examine organizational change. And quite frankly, I'm excited as the research goes on to learn right alongside other people. I'm not just trying to do this myself, trying to just spread this out as much as I can. So lastly, first things first, I need to finish up my dissertation. One of the downsides of this type of research is that it is not looking at change as a personality trait. It's not about, oh, I like change or I don't like change. It's asking about one particular organizational change. And I actually have a 19-question valid assessment for the dissertation that I just need an organization to sign up and do it. I've had a couple where they've had to make changes and we've had to delay it. And So I've already got folks signed up for the second part, which is I'm also doing ongoing research because the organizations that wanted to get involved in the initial upfront research said, well, we want to do snapshots over time so we can see the changes. And that's what you see at number 2 is the ongoing research that I'm going to do. The folks at Academy of Management were very encouraging and says, hey, we better see you next year presenting the results so we can see the data. And I'd love for that to happen, and I'm working towards making that happen. If you have any thoughts or feedback, questions, if you're interested in this at all, please shoot me an email. It's ron@changestudy.com. And I have a quick synopsis, not as detailed as this presentation, but some of the information that you would need if you're interested in this. That's also at www.changestudy.com. Thank you for your time, and have a good one.